Hey everybody, this is the first of a series of videos where we're going to learn how to record Visual Basic macros. This is actually the first in a long series of videos on this channel related to using Visual Basic for application inside Microsoft Excel. And so we're going to start with the basics. In this video, I'm going to show you how to essentially enable Visual Basic for applications. There are some steps you have to take before you can even begin to use VBA in Excel to record macros or to do anything else. And so I want to make sure you do this. And you only have to do it once to get these settings established, and then every time you launch Excel after that, everything's available. So Visual Basic for Applications is a very powerful scripting language built into Microsoft Excel, and it allows you to write code in a script format that automates tasks and enables you to customize Excel to do things that it wasn't originally capable of doing, that can make you incredibly productive as an Excel user. And so these tools are all located in the Developer tab. Now when you first launch Excel and you haven't used these tools before, you won't see this tab. You have to explicitly turn it on, and you do that by going to the File menu and selecting the Options command. And you need to select, first of all, Customize Ribbon. And if you go over here, you'll notice these are the tabs that show up at the top of your Excel window. And one of these is the Developer tab. So we're going to turn that on, and it has some subsections. And you can turn those on and off individually, but we're going to leave them all on. So we just want to turn on the Developer tab. And that will make the Developer tab show up. But there's something else we need to do before we get too far. I'm going to go back into that option, or into the Excel options. We also need to go to the Trust Center and to the Trust Center settings. And there's a section here called Macro Settings. Macros are sometimes what we call our Visual Basic code. And it turns out that macros in Excel are, while being incredibly productive, they're also a useful way to write viruses. And so you have to be careful. If you get an Excel spreadsheet sent to you via email from someone you don't know, don't open it. You'll get a series of warnings, so the risk is relatively small. But generally, you want to avoid, macros from people you don't know. And so because of this security concern, the default setting in Microsoft Excel is to disable all macros. So if you open up a macro-enabled workbook and using the default settings, it's just going to disable the macros. They won't run. Or the second option is disable macros with notification. In this case, when you open it up, it'll say, well, this workbook contains macros, they've been disabled, and you have to go in and turn them on. Another one is to disable all macros except digitally signed. There's a way to create a macro and have it certified that it's safe, and we won't be doing that in our videos. And the final option is to enable all macros. Not recommended, potentially dangerous code can run. Actually, I think that warning is a little strong. If you're going to be doing a lot of coding of Visual Basic on your own, this is definitely the option I would recommend. Just enable the macros. Every time you open one up, it will turn it on, and you'll be good to go. And you also want to trust access to the VBA project object model as well. So enable all macros, trust access, and at that point, click OK, and we should be good to go. Now, again, once you've done that, anytime you launch Excel from now on, you will not need to do that again. The Developer tab will show up. that macro setting that you entered it'll remember that and enable that from that point on until you turn it off. So yeah, once we've done that, a couple things I want to mention. Now, once you've turned that on, and if you do File Save As, and I'm just going to pick a location here. When you do File Save As, you'll notice by default when you create a spreadsheet, normally it saves it as a .xlsx file. That extension .slsx means it's just a normal Excel workbook. But once you've created Visual Basic Code, it's very important that you save it as a .xlsm file. The M instead of the X on the end means it's a macro-enabled workbook. If you create Visual Basic Code and save it as a .xlsx file, first of all, it'll give you a warning. Hey, if you say this workbook contains macros, if you save it in this format, they'll be lost. And if you ignore that warning and save it and then open it back up, all your macros will be gone. So now that you're going to be working in Visual Basic, whenever you have Visual Basic, save it as a .xlsm file. Now, I have seen people who, once they start doing this, they save even their regular workbooks as .xlsm. I don't recommend that, because you should only save it as a macro-enabled workbook if it indeed contains macros. Otherwise, you're going to send it to someone, and they may not have those security settings set up the way that you just did. And so they're going to have, they're not going to be able to open your workbook or run it. Or they're going to get warnings that they don't need to. If it doesn't contain macros, don't save it as a .xlsm file. But if it does, you need to do that or you'll lose everything. So that's another thing that we need to be aware of. And then once you're in the Developer tab, you'll see a number of sections here. This section in Controls, this is used to create insert buttons and checkboxes and option controls, which we are going to explore quite extensively later on in some of our additional videos that will be coming up. And then there's also this thing about design mode and run mode that has to do with the controls. There's a section here on add-ins where you can control add-ins. Add-ins are basically macros that you can drop into your workbook that somebody else has developed that you can then use to accomplish a number of things. Normally you can't edit the code on an add-in, but it provides a lot of power for you. And then the here's an XML section over here that we're not going to use. And then over here on the left, there's this code section, and that has a couple of things. Number one, you click on the macro security, and it takes you right back to this Trust Center that we looked at earlier to enable or disable macros and trust access to the VBA project object model. And then there's a macros setting, and this, if you have a macro defined, which we're going to cover here in our next video, this allows you to run it, and you can also record macros. And then finally, this last one on the left, this toggles you to if you click on that, that'll bring up the Visual Basic for Applications Editor, or the VBA Editor window. And this essentially provides you access to all of the Visual Basic code associated with your workbook. And that can be organized by sheet. If you double click on a sheet, it will bring up the code associated with that sheet. Now there's nothing in there right now because we haven't created any. And typically the code that goes into a sheet is code associated with controls, buttons, and so forth. And you have a separate object here for each of your sheets, and then there's a window for the workbook in general, and we'll cover this in some of our later videos. And then sometimes you'll see a window here that says modules, and that's when you record a macro, that code goes there, and then this is a properties window that we'll be using. And so in general, your code shows up over here in this gray area, and this is like a project explorer over here. Now, by the way, I talked about an add-in a minute ago that in my version of Excel, I've enabled the solver add-in, which is a free add-in that comes with Excel. And if I click on that, it'll prompt me for a password, and I don't know the password, of course, but the developer could use this link here to access the solver code. So that's going to be shown there. And then if you have multiple workbooks open, each of them will be listed here, and you can access the code associated with each one. Now, when you're working with code, you want to go back to Excel, you just click on that button. Again, this toggles you over to the editor. This little symbol right here takes you right back to Excel. You can also right-click on a sheet tab down here and select View Code, and it'll pop you over to the editor and bring up the code associated with that particular sheet. So that's kind of how you navigate things once you turn things on. And so now we are ready to start creating macros, and that will be covered in our next video.